Congratulations, you're fired, the CEO sneered at me, his words slicing through the quiet tension in the glass conference room. He looked satisfied, as if he had been waiting for this moment all week. I looked around at the faces staring back at me. There were maybe a dozen people in that room, but it felt like 100. I could see the interns pressing themselves into the hallway, trying to catch a glimpse through the glass. On the far side of the table, the investors sat in silence, blinking as if they weren't sure what they had just witnessed. I didn't give the CEO the pleasure of seeing me crumble. I stood up slowly, smoothing my skirt with hands that barely shook. My badge felt heavier than ever as I unclipped it from my blouse. I placed it, along with the company credit card, right on top of the latest quarterly report. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the silence grow. Then, I looked straight at the CEO and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "When will you tell your investors that your servers crash 26 times a day?" My voice echoed, cutting through the heavy hush. I watched the CEO's eyes narrow, and then I looked over to the investors. The three men from Boston, Mr. Avery, Mr. Doyle, and Mr. Price, shifted uncomfortably, red spots blooming on their faces. The woman from London, Miss Bradshaw, gripped her pen so tightly I thought it might break. No one spoke for a second, but you could feel the air charged with electricity. The CEO's face, usually pink and cheerful, now went red, his lips tightening into a flat line. I could sense the ripple of panic starting in the room, crawling down the hallway like a chill. The staff outside, all those quiet faces who had always said nothing, now pressed closer to the glass. I turned on my heel and walked out, my shoes echoing on the tile. As I passed the reception desk, I caught the eyes of Sarah from finance. She mouthed, "Thank you," with a tiny, tired smile. Behind me, voices began to rise. First whispers, then scattered words, then open chaos as people tried to make sense of what just happened. The elevator ride down was strangely quiet. I felt the weight of the moment, but I also felt something else, something lighter, almost relief. By the time I reached the lobby, my heart was pounding, but not with fear. Maybe it was excitement. Maybe it was freedom. I stepped outside onto Fifth Avenue. The air in Manhattan that day was hot and bright, the city alive with the energy of 1,000 lives rushing past each other. Taxis honked, buses rumbled by, and a street vendor was shouting about fresh bagels. For the first time in months, I really saw the city. It felt surreal to be unemployed. I had been with that company for 6 years, moving up from junior analyst to head of product. I remembered my first day in that building, how proud I felt swiping my badge through the security gate, thinking I had finally made it. Now, walking out with nothing but a box of personal things, it was like closing the door on a version of myself that I'd outgrown. I paused at the corner, letting the sun warm my face. I thought about the last 6 months at the company. Every morning, I would wake up before sunrise, force myself to run 3 miles just to shake off the dread, and then fight my way through the subway crowds. The company was growing fast, burning through investor cash and cutting corners everywhere. I had tried to warn him, the CEO, that the servers couldn't handle the volume. He brushed me off every time. "Don't worry," he said. "You're the best we've got." But he never listened. Maybe I shouldn't have said it in front of everyone. Maybe I should have kept quiet, taken my severance, and left with my head down. But as I watched the CEO's face when I said those words about the servers, I realized I didn't care anymore. I was tired of pretending things were fine. I was tired of fixing everything and getting blamed when it broke again. The CEO was always so focused on the next round of investment, the next big pitch. He cared more about how things looked than how they worked. I couldn't be part of it any longer. I called my best friend Julia as I started walking towards Central Park. "Guess what?" I said, trying to sound casual. She picked up on the first ring. "Don't tell me you finally quit," I laughed. "No, I got fired in front of everyone." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" "I think so," I said, surprised to find it was true. "Actually, I feel better than I have in a long time." As I walked, my phone buzzed with texts from coworkers, some supportive, a few just shocked. Sarah from finance sent a simple, "You were right." Mark from engineering joked, "Want to start our own company?" The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted to do next. I had a little over $12,000 in savings, plus a few months of severance if I was lucky. Not much, not in New York, but enough to take a breath. By the time I reached the park, the chaos of the office felt far away. I sat on a bench and watched a group of kids chasing pigeons, their laughter echoing across the grass. I let myself breathe for the first time in months. The city felt different. I was still in New York, still surrounded by strangers, but I was no longer trapped by a job that had become a cage. I looked up at the blue sky and wondered what would come next. I didn't have a plan, and that was scary. But sitting there, listening to the sounds of the city, I realized I had something better than a plan. I had a story that was finally my own. The subway ride back to Brooklyn felt like it lasted a lifetime. I stood pressed between a man reading the Wall Street Journal and a young woman humming along to music only she could hear. My cardboard box balanced on my hip. Inside the box was everything I owned at work, a faded photo of my sister and me on a Ferris wheel, a half-used notebook filled with lists and half-baked ideas, a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Manager," and a small cactus named Spike. It was amazing how quickly 6 years of your life could be packed into a single, battered box. The city rushed by outside, but all I could think about was my tiny apartment on the top floor of a brownstone in Park Slope. My place wasn't much. Just 2 small rooms and a bathroom the size of a closet, but it was mine. The building creaked at night, and the heat clanked through ancient radiators in winter, but I loved it. I especially loved the people who lived around me. Mark and Julia, my neighbors across the hall, were like family. Their dog, Winston, a huge golden retriever with an attitude problem, was the unofficial hallway guard and best friend to anyone with treats. When I finally made it up the stairs, my arms aching and my brain buzzing, I saw Mark waiting for me by their door, mug of coffee in hand. He was wearing his favorite faded Red Sox shirt, which always made me laugh because he was born and raised in Queens and had never once been to Boston. "What happened?" he asked as I reached the landing. His tone was gentle, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I set down the box and tried to smile. "I got fired," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The CEO did it in front of everyone, but honestly, I think it's good. I was done with that place." The relief in my voice surprised even me. Mark's eyebrows shot up, but before he could say anything else, Julia appeared at the door. She had a talent for timing, always knowing when someone needed her. She didn't even ask, she just wrapped her arms around me in a hug that smelled like vanilla and lavender. "You'll land on your feet," she said, her voice warm and certain. "Want to order pizza? My treat." Inside their apartment, Winston bounded up to greet me, tail wagging so hard it thumped against the walls. I scratched his ears, letting the dog's simple joy ease some of the weight pressing down on my shoulders. Mark ordered pizza from our favorite place on 7th Avenue, pepperoni for him, veggie for Julia, and one loaded with everything for me because he knew I'd need comfort food tonight. We sat around their little kitchen table, the kind that looked like it belonged in a farmhouse instead of a Brooklyn apartment, and I told them everything. I described the CEO's smug grin, the way the investors' faces had gone red, and how everyone in the company seemed to panic as soon as I walked out. I even imitated the exact way the CEO said, "Congratulations, you're fired," which made Julia snort so hard she almost spit out her soda. We laughed about the company's servers, which crashed more than a toddler on a sugar high, and how I had practically become the only person holding the whole place together. Mark shook his head, grinning. "You should send them an invoice for all the times you fixed their mess," he joked. "And charge them double. Triple, even, since they made you do it in heels." After a while, the laughter faded and a comfortable silence settled in. Julia poured us glasses of red wine, the cheap kind, and we sat on the living room floor, legs stretched out, Winston curled up between us. The city lights glowed through the window, painting patterns on the hardwood. I told them about my savings, about $12,000 left in my account. Not much by New York standards, but it was something. For years, I had worked 60-hour weeks, skipping vacations, working through holidays, always promising myself I'd slow down next year. Next year never came. I was always too busy, too tired, too afraid to stop and think about what I wanted. Mark leaned back, looking thoughtful. "Maybe this is your sign," he said. "Take a break. Do something for yourself. You've spent years making other people rich. Don't you think it's time you got to live a little?" Julia nodded, her eyes soft. Go somewhere, see a new city. You love Chicago, why not visit? Or take that trip to Europe you always talked about. The idea of leaving New York, even for a little while, was both terrifying and exciting. I had built my whole life around this city, around this job, around the routine of getting up before sunrise and coming home long after dark. But now, with nothing holding me back, the possibilities seemed endless. I felt a spark inside me, small but growing. We spent the rest of the night planning imaginary trips and talking about all the things I could do now that I was free. Mark made a list on a napkin, top 10 things you're not allowed to do, with rules like no checking work email and no taking jobs from companies with more than 2 ping pong tables in their lobby. Julia started looking up flights to Chicago and London, reading out prices in dollars and pounds, making us laugh with her terrible British accent. By midnight, I had made a decision. I was going to take a break. Maybe for a few weeks, maybe longer. I would use my savings to pay rent and bills for a while and just breathe. For once, I wanted to live for myself, not for a company or a boss who saw me as nothing more than a line on a budget sheet. As I walked back to my apartment that night, the city felt different, lighter. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Money would run out, and I would have to find another job eventually. But for now, I had friends who cared about me, a roof over my head, and a chance to start over. I fell asleep listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark from Winston in the hallway, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't dream about work at all. Leaving New York was harder than I thought it would be. My last night in Brooklyn, I sat on my fire escape with a cup of coffee, watching the city lights blink and shimmer. I thought about everything I was leaving behind: the noisy neighbors, the corner bodega with its questionable sandwiches, even the subway delays that always made me late but gave me good stories to tell. I thought about Mark and Julia, who had become my chosen family, and how they hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe before I got in the taxi to the airport. Winston barked at me as if he understood I wouldn't be coming back for a while. I promised them all I'd call, send pictures, and maybe not come running back the moment things got hard. Chicago was waiting for me with wide streets, clean air, and a lake that looked like an ocean. The first morning I arrived, I stood at the edge of Lake Michigan, the wind whipping my hair across my face, and breathed in the smell of water and possibility. The city felt different from New York, less frantic, more open, but still full of that same American energy. That push and pull of people trying to make something of themselves. I took it all in and tried to believe that I belonged here. I had found a small house for rent on the north side before I left New York. I'd seen the listing online. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a little porch with a white swing and a postage stamp yard. The rent was $1,600 a month, more than I wanted to spend. But the place felt right in a way I couldn't explain. I signed the lease over the phone, transferred a month's rent from my dwindling savings, and prayed that I wouldn't regret it. The first night, I slept on an air mattress, surrounded by boxes and the soft hum of the old refrigerator. The house creaked at night, settling into its bones. It reminded me a little of my apartment in Brooklyn, but with more room to grow. My days quickly fell into a gentle rhythm. Each morning, I sat on the porch with a mug of strong coffee and a notebook, writing out everything I was afraid of and everything I hoped for. The street was quiet but alive, kids biking to school, neighbors walking their dogs, delivery trucks rumbling by. Sometimes Mrs. Kinney, my neighbor to the left, would wave at me from her porch swing, her tiny dog yapping beside her. There was a peacefulness to it, a kind of slow, steady joy I hadn't felt in years. I spent that first week settling in and letting myself rest. For the first time in ages, I didn't set an alarm or rush to check my email. I unpacked slowly, arranging my books on the shelves, hanging a few photos of my family and friends on the walls, making the place mine. I tried deep dish pizza at a local spot called Lou's. So much cheese I had to eat it with a fork and knife, and decided Chicagoans were onto something. I walked for miles along the lake, letting the wind clear my head and watching the city skyline shimmer in the distance. But as the days passed, reality crept back in. My savings were shrinking faster than I liked, and I knew I couldn't live off porch swings and pizza forever. So I polished my resume, updated my LinkedIn profile, and started sending out job applications. I told myself, this time I wouldn't settle. I wouldn't work for another company that cared more about numbers than people. I wouldn't take a job just because it sounded impressive. I wanted to work somewhere that actually meant something to me, even if it took a while to find. At night, I caught up with Mark and Julia over video calls, telling them about the quirks of my new house and the neighbors who left baskets of apples on my doorstep. Mark made me promise not to spend all my money on pizza, and Julia kept sending me links to job postings and quirky Chicago museums I should visit. Their voices kept me grounded, reminding me that I was never really alone, no matter how far I'd traveled. Then, one gray Thursday afternoon, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. The area code was unfamiliar, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was warm, confident, and a little amused. "Hi, is this Evelyn?" she asked. I said yes, my heart thumping in my chest. "This is Helen Jackson. I'm with Firefly Tech here in Chicago. We came across your blog post about speaking up in toxic workplaces. Honestly, we loved it. We want someone with your guts. Can you come in tomorrow for a chat?" My first reaction was disbelief. I had almost forgotten I'd published that blog post late one sleepless night in Brooklyn, just to get the anger and sadness out of my system. But somehow, my words had made their way to the right person at the right time. "Absolutely," I said, trying to sound calm even though I was practically dancing around my living room. "What time?" The next morning, I put on my best blazer blue, not black, because I was starting a new chapter and needed something brighter. The Firefly Tech office was in a renovated warehouse near the river. When I walked in, I was greeted by real plants, real sunlight, and the smell of actual coffee, not the burnt stuff I was used to. People smiled at me as I passed, and no one seemed rushed or afraid. Helen was waiting in a bright meeting room, her short hair wild and her laugh infectious. She asked about my story, not just my resume. We talked about what it meant to be brave at work, about making mistakes and learning from them, about building something good with people you trust. Helen leaned across the table, grinning. "We need someone like you, someone who isn't afraid to speak up, even if it makes the room uncomfortable. We'll pay you $85,000 a year. In dollars, not stock options and dreams. You get health insurance and 2 weeks vacation. More if you need it." I didn't even have to think about it. I accepted on the spot. For the first time since leaving New York, I felt the knot in my stomach loosen. I had a job, but more than that, I had a fresh start, a real chance. That night, I sat on my porch swing and watched the sun set over my new street. The sky turned purple and gold, and the sound of kids playing drifted across the yards. I felt proud, scared, and hopeful, all at once. Chicago wasn't home yet, but maybe it would be soon. I closed my eyes and promised myself, this time I would write my own story and make it a good one. It took time, but I grew to love Chicago. My new house, with its creaky floors and old porch swing, slowly became more than just a place to sleep. It became a true home. The rhythm of the city seeped into my bones. The sound of trains in the distance, the buzz of families walking dogs in the evening, the scent of fresh bread from the corner bakery drifting in on Saturday mornings. There was space here, not just in the wide streets and big sky, but in my own life too. It was as if Chicago had handed me a clean sheet of paper and invited me to start writing all over again. After the whirlwind of starting my new job at Firefly Tech, I finally began to settle into a new routine. The work itself was nothing like my old company. People actually listened when I spoke, sometimes with serious attention, sometimes with laughter, always with respect. It felt strange at first to offer an idea and see people nod thoughtfully. To watch as Helen, my boss, would pause meetings just to make sure everyone had a chance to speak. Nobody cared about the name of my college or how much money I'd made at my last job. They cared about what I could build, how I could help, and who I wanted to become. I never had that before, and every day I felt my confidence growing a little more. Evenings in my neighborhood became my favorite time of day. As summer rolled in, the air grew warm and heavy, carrying with it the sweet smell of cut grass and the sound of kids laughing in the street. My house became a gathering place, not just for me but for the people I met. Sometimes it was just me and Mrs. Parker, my neighbor from 2 doors down, sitting on the porch swing with mugs of tea. She'd lived on this block for 50 years and seemed to know every secret of every house and every crack in the sidewalk. I remember when this street was just dirt, she'd say, shaking her head as if she still didn't believe it had changed. She brought over apple pie whenever she baked, always insisting I take half home with me, even when I tried to protest. Her stories made me feel connected to something bigger, like I was now part of the neighborhood story too. Other nights, the porch would fill with new friends from work. Tom from marketing, who played guitar and liked to argue about baseball. Priya, a programmer who made everyone laugh so hard we cried. Olivia, who grew up in Chicago and knew the best hidden restaurants. We'd order takeout or cook together in my kitchen, the radio playing quietly in the background. There was no pressure to impress anyone. I didn't have to be the strong one, or the fixer, or the one who knows everything. I could just be myself, messy and figuring things out, and happy to be included. Then, one golden evening in late September, Mark and Julia came to visit from New York. I met them at the airport, waving like an idiot from behind the crowd. They both looked tired but happy, and as soon as we saw each other, we hugged so tight, I thought my ribs would crack. Driving back through the city, I pointed out the sights, the lake, the skyline, the pizza place where I'd eaten way too many dinners. "This is so different," Julia said, gazing out at the wide streets and parks. "You look different too, happier." That night, we sat on the porch long after the sun had set, wrapped in sweaters, sipping cheap wine from mismatched mugs. Mark told stories from his new job back in Brooklyn, and Julia shared the latest neighborhood gossip. We laughed until we cried, just like old times. Mrs. Parker popped over with a plate of her famous apple pie. And before long, she was telling us all about how she met her husband at a dance in 1969. It felt like family, like every good thing about New York had somehow followed me here. At work, things continued to change for the better. I took on new projects, working late sometimes, but never because I was afraid. I worked late because I was excited. People challenged me, pushed me to think bigger, to try new things. When I made mistakes, Helen would say, "We only get better by learning, Evelyn. Try again." That trust meant everything to me. It didn't take long before I was promoted to team leader. When Helen called me into her office to tell me, she said, "We see what you bring to this team. Don't ever doubt it." My raise was real $10,000 more a year, and came with an extra week of paid vacation. I called Mark and Julia to tell them the news, and they both screamed loud enough that Winston barked in the background. Some nights, I'd walk to the lakefront after dinner and just watch the city lights reflected in the water. I thought about who I used to be, a woman running herself ragged in Manhattan, measuring her worth by the size of her paycheck or the praise of a man who never cared. I thought about the day I got fired, how small and scared I felt, how certain I was that everything good in my life had ended. Standing by the lake, I understood now that it was the beginning. Losing my job had forced me to look at myself in a new way. It broke me open and let the light in. One evening, as I watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized how much my story had changed. I used to think I needed to prove myself, to be perfect, to work harder than everyone else, to keep pushing even when it hurt. Now I knew the truth. I only needed to be myself. That was enough. My friends, my neighbors, my new team at work, they all saw me, the real me, and they welcomed me in. Sometimes you do need to lose everything to find out who you are. I never would have chosen to get fired. I never would have chosen to leave New York or to spend months wondering what would happen next. But standing there, surrounded by new friends and old, in a city that finally felt like home, I understood that the things I'd lost had made room for something bigger than I could have imagined. As the evening cooled and the first stars came out, I closed my eyes and let myself be grateful. For the hard times and the good. For the people who held me up and the courage I found when I thought I had none left. For my story, my own, at last.